All right, as we get started this morning, I want you to take out your bulletin and look on the back page where it says Sermon Notes. What's the church to do? And you see a big blank. Okay, that's not really what that means. Hopefully you don't think that I just put this together last night after the bulletin was already printed. That's not the case. No, I'll just give you a little insight because most Sundays after music, I'm out in the congregation listening to the pastor. And I really do. I like sermon notes, and I'm a big proponent of that. Kind of helps you keep focused and fill in the blanks as you go along. But what I have found as I sit out there is that we're filling in the blanks, and we get to the last blank, and we fill that in, and what happens? Man, we tune out. We're done. Pastor may have another 10 minutes or so of good stuff left, but we kind of tune out. We shut put it in our Bible, zip it up. And so you don't know when I'm going to finish today, okay? Ha, ha, ha. I like to do things a little differently occasionally, so that's where we're at. Just take notes as you see anything noteworthy to take, I guess. How about that? Probably have a lot of empty bulletins when we're done, but no, I'm glad you're here today. A few weeks ago, Pastor started the series on what do we do now? What is the church supposed to do? And there's a lot of things. There's a lot of things that as the church we're supposed to be doing. And a couple of those things really kind of fall under my umbrella. And so it was good. He asked me a couple of weeks ago to preach, and as I got to thinking about it, it really fits some of the emphases that we're trying to do. A couple of those things are missions and ministry. And those are two terms that it's hard to define, but you know what it is. I know what missions is, I know what ministry is, but if I were to define it, it might be a little more difficult because there is some overlap in both of those. And so I tried my best to come up with a couple of definitions. Ministry, now this is to me, ministry is meeting needs. That can be a physical need, that can be a spiritual need. So we can have a handyman ministry, we can have a Sunday school ministry, we got youth over raking the leaves of a widow's house, that's ministry. So you've got doing things or meeting needs, both physical and spiritual. And then missions, in my mind, is doing those things that move non-believers closer to God. And we especially think that as being outside of our zip code, usually. And when we think about that, we usually think of witnessing and preaching as being those two main things that move non-believers. They may not come to faith in Christ right then, but at least they're making that step, and they're getting a little bit closer to God as a result of that. Now, there are some overlap. We go on a mission trip, and sometimes we do ministry, and some of the things we do, let's just take roofing a house. Let's say we roof the house of one of our widows. Okay, that's ministry. Now, if we roof the house of that widow's neighbor that's an unbeliever, that, we're showing the love of Christ. In a way, that's ministry. In a way, that's mission. So it gets kind of conglomerated something after, if you do too much analysis. But saying that, what we tend to do a lot of times is compartmentalize those two. And what I mean by that is we can be missions-minded. We can be a missions-minded church. We can be a missions-minded individual. We can take up offerings. We have our 3 offerings that we take up during the year, special missions emphasis. Participate in fundraisers, go on trips, all these kind of things. But too many times people are missions-minded only at church. We think of missions, we think of ministry, we think of how do we get the church involved. And that's fine, but that's sometimes too compartmentalized. We don't look for those mission and ministry opportunities at our place of work, at our neighborhood, those areas that we have influence in. So we need to move from that having a mindset or being missions-minded, be ministry-minded, to more of a lifestyle of ministry and missions. And that's where the term missional lifestyle comes into play. That may be a new term to you, maybe not, but missional is kind of one of those buzzwords that's been around for maybe 10 years or so. And basically what that means is you're a missionary wherever you are. You're doing missions, you're doing ministry wherever you are. So that changes that mindset of, I know something that needs to be done, let's call the church and maybe they can get something going. Okay? That may be part of it. Yes, I hear Siri is in the audience today. That's great. Anyway, being a missionary wherever you are, not waiting on a church program, not waiting on a church function, a church meeting to do it, but doing missions where you are, and that may involve getting other people involved in the church as well. So I'm going to share some thoughts today on becoming a missional person, and then expanding that to a missional church as well. Our text today is in Luke chapter 10. It's a very familiar passage. It's the only place in the Gospels where this parable is recorded. It's the parable of the Good Samaritan. And we're going to see how that applies toward ministry and into missions as well. Give you a little background as you're turning to Luke chapter 10. An expert in the law comes to Jesus, and he says, and this is kind of a rough translation, paraphrase here, Jesus, what must I do to have eternal life? And Jesus, like he normally does, turns that question back around to the person asking it and says, well, basically, you're an expert in the law. What does the law say? And the guy says, well, two main things. I've got to love God with all my being, and I've got to love my neighbor as myself. Jesus, hey, you got it. Great. Go and do likewise. And then it says the man, in order to justify himself, says, well, who's my neighbor? Be specific, because how those experts in the law are. They want to be particular. So if I need to love this person, but I don't have to love that person, then I'm not going to spend my time on this person. I'm going to spend my time loving this person so I can go to heaven. See, to me, that's kind of the mindset that the guy is, to justify himself. So that brings us to our passage, Luke 10, verses 30 through 37. The man has asked, who is my neighbor? And so in reply, Jesus said, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he fell into the hands of robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed on the other side. So too, a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, took him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 silver coins. Your version may say 2 denarii. A denarius was about a day's wage for a common laborer. So he took 2 days of wages, to these coins, and gave them to the innkeeper. And he said, look after him, he said, and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense that you may have. And Jesus goes on, which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? The expert of the law replied, the one who had mercy on him. And Jesus told him, go and do likewise. All right, well, I'm going to have to, as we get started here, have to give credit where credit's due, because I'm really not a plagiarizer. But as I was thinking about wanting to do a sermon on missions and ministry, I was thinking back on when our church, and not this church, but my previous 2 churches went through Purpose-Driven Life. And I remember that the sermon on ministry. I thought that's really what I wanted to say. And then I think First Baptist Whitehall went through that probably about 8 or 9 years ago. It was right before I got here. Anyway, so just to give credit, the skeleton part of this sermon is his, and I fill it in with some Jim-isms as we go. But I didn't, a lot of people take notes and stuff, and I didn't want somebody to come back and say, well, this is a Rick Warren sermon. So just giving a little credit here as we go along. All right, well, let's look at 3 attitudes toward ministry, and then we'll apply those to missions as well. Let's go on to that next screen. There we go. Our first attitude is being too blind to see. Being too blind to see. Now, this can be intentional, or it may not be intentional, but a lot of folks are just completely unaware of the needs around them. They're just, I guess they got the blinders on or whatever. One reason for that is something that modern-day folks have called cocooning, which is, we leave our jobs, get into our car, the windows are all rolled up because we've got the AC on or the heater on or whatever, and we're driving down the road. We get to our house, we pull in the driveway, we hit the button, we go into the garage, we hit the button, the garage door closes, we go into our nice little cocoon of a house. We don't sit out on the front porch like they did 50 years ago and talk with our neighbors, before air conditioning became so popular. Thank goodness we're born in this time, right? But that's not the culture that we live in. We live in the cocooning culture. And because of that, a lot of people are just so focused on themselves, their schedule, or whatever, they're just too blind to see the needs of folks around them. We can do anything from home now. We can shop any store online, have it delivered to our house. With my smartphone, I can order pizza and have it delivered. We can even go to church online. You probably know this, but our church records our services. We put them out on YouTube every week, and then on our church website, we link that to those YouTube, so you can go back and listen to the sermons on a weekly basis. So, not telling you to stay home and listen to it on YouTube. I'm just saying that, we can, when you're sick or infirmed, you may do that. But we are very busy people. We are very, very busy people. And the busyness can lead to us having those blinders. We are just too busy for our own good. And parents and grandparents, I think you know this, but we can be at fault for doing that to our kids. We're raising our kids to be way too busy of kids, because we take them from soccer practice to dance to baseball to this to that, and all these things we've got them involved in, and they're not bad things, but there's just too many of them going on. And if we're lucky, we might have some time left over for some church activities and maybe some God in there, if we're lucky. So just think about that, parents, as you look at your kids' schedule. So the attitude for this reasoning is this. I don't see the needs around me. I don't see the needs. And like I said, sometimes it's intentional. I don't want to see it. And sometimes it's just that we're too focused on what we're doing, our lives, our agenda, that we don't see the needs of people around us. We'll get down to our second mindset. That's that I'm curious but uninvolved. Curious but uninvolved. And I think both of our first two guys are religious guys, our priest and our Levite. Actually, they fall into this category. See, they're going down the same road at different times. They both pass by the guy. They both see the man in need. And they see him, and they come over here on this side of the road and continue on. Actually, this mindset, I think, is worse than the first. In the first, you're just oblivious. This one, you know there's a need. You just opt not to do anything about it. Now, in this mindset, in the curious but uninvolved, I think we can have two different extremes here. The first one, and I actually, after service, got asked, how do you spell this? Looky-loo. You know what a looky-loo is, right? Well, I'm going to tell you. Okay, let's say we're going to Little Rock, and let's pretend that we have no road construction. Okay, that's in a fantasy world somewhere. But we're going to Little Rock, there's no road construction, and for some reason, our lanes just come to a crawl, almost to a halt. And as we finally we notice that over here in the southbound lane, coming back to Redfield, to Whitehall, we've got, there's an accident over here. Well, what's happened? We've had the looky-loos, the rubberneckers, who slow down and look, and they want to see what all's going on. No, they have no intention of stopping and helping. They're just curious. They're curious, but they're not involved. So you've got that extreme, as well as the other extreme. You look, you realize there's a need there, and you just avoid it altogether. And I'll give you a couple of examples there. Just this last week, we were watching a TV show, and the commercial came on, and it was the sad song, Cry, There's Animals Hurting All Over. You know that one, abused animals. And I'm not making light. I mean, really, that's an issue. But I don't want to watch that. Okay, I've seen one commercial, that's enough for me. And so I flip over to another station, and we were flipping around. Come back, the commercial's still on. That commercial must have ran for like 7 minutes, because every time I came back, the commercial was on. I didn't want to see that. Okay, I know there's a need. I really just don't want to get involved with that. Somebody else will handle that, We do the same thing with those folks with the "We'll work for food" signs as well, don't we? We see them, and then we pretend. Now, I'm not saying that I've ever done this, but maybe somebody has. You're driving down, you see somebody, and then you pretend like you're talking to your wife, and so you don't really see this person. Has that ever happened to you? I've read that in a book somewhere. Okay. Now, I have been the recipient of that kind of behavior for the last several years. Around Christmas time, our church has taken a day or or two and have rung the Salvation Army bell over at Cranford's. And normally, we're on the north side of that parking lot. Let's show that picture that we got next. I told George Ashcraft in the first service, I said, hey, I got your picture in my sermon. And he thought, yeah. And then he was surprised to see him and Charlotte there a few years ago was ringing there at Cranford's. And so we're normally on the north side. We're ringing the bell. And it's funny. People will come and they will park on the north side, get out of their car, and they'll hear the bell or see you ringing. And then they'll go over here. They'll walk across. It's funny because I'm over here watching. And then they'll go in that south side entrance because they know there's a need. They know, that it's a legitimate need. It's a legitimate charity, but don't want to be involved with that. So we'll kind of bypass that. That's what folks will do. All right, now what I'm not saying every time there's a tear-jerking commercial on TV, you have to give to it. I'm not saying every time you see somebody with a sign, you have to give to it. Because I think Brandon may have shared this in here. I know he shared it with me. I'm not sure if he shared it with the church, but maybe a year or so ago, he was out and around in Pine Bluff, and there was a guy, will work for food or something like that. So he went to McDonald's, got the guy a bunch of food, came back, gave it to the guy. The guy took it and threw it back in his car. He didn't want that. He wanted some money. Okay. That happens, right? That happens from time to time. But, so I'm not saying to give to every cause that you see out there, because sometimes I think God puts people in situations of need to teach them a lesson, okay? Now, I'm not meaning to be harsh, but sometimes that's the case, and I need to, let's say he's putting me in that position, and I need to learn to trust God. I need to rely on him. I'm not necessarily needing to be rescued, and sometimes that's, as a Christian, we might think that's our duty, is to rescue everybody, but sometimes we might be thwarting the will of God by doing that. So just put that in the back of your mind. So it gets back to us. We have to be spiritually in tune enough with God to know, to realize, to discern when there's a need that I need to give to. Or maybe that person has a need, but somebody else needs to be the giver. Okay? So we just need to be a little more in tune there with God. So all that to say, you don't have to necessarily give to everything you see, but when you feel God tugging on your heartstrings to do something, to give, to be charitable for something, and you ignore that, that's where we fit into the second mindset. I know there's a need. I feel God leading me there, but I don't want to do it. I don't want to get involved. Don't want to get my hands dirty. Can't afford it, whatever. Now, the attitude, the reasoning behind this, like those first two guys on the road, is I see a need, but somebody else will handle that. I see a need, but somebody else will handle that. Let's get that up there on the screen, too. I see a need. Someone else will handle it. And that's what I did with the doggy commercial. That's what we do with the signs. That's what we do. Our last mindset that we should have is that of a good neighbor. Like a good neighbor. This is the attitude of the Good Samaritan. And this is the gist of the love your neighbor as yourself mindset. You remember the guy asked because he wanted to justify himself. So he said, who's my neighbor? And that's what prompted Jesus to tell this parable. Now here's a good example of why it's important to know some of the historical and cultural context of the story, because the Samaritans were not liked at all by the Jewish people. The Samaritans were, not really a good way to say it, they were half-breed Jews. Years before, their ancestors had been transported off to another country, and then mixed, intermarried with the other culture, brought back and planted in there. So they were had some Jewish heritage, but they weren't full-blood Jews. And so the Jewish people despised them. And so in their country in Samaria, what would happen is if you were in the south and wanted to go to the north and had to pass through Samaria, what you'd do is you would jot over across the Jordan River, go up, and go back over to avoid going through the country. And it wasn't because it was dangerous. It wasn't because of the terrain. It was because they hated the people so much that they didn't want anything to do with them. Even passing through the country probably made them feel unclean. So they didn't do that. It would be like us, wouldn't be so bad in a car, but on foot, going from here to Little Rock, but going by way of Stuttgart. Okay, that just doesn't make sense, does it? But that's kind of what they were doing here. So the Samaritans, they were different. They were different racially. They were different politically. They were different religiously as well. So Jesus is making, I think, a very important point here. Just don't minister to your own folks. Now, we do have, we do have commands to minister to our church people. In fact, that's why the deacons were first established, was to help the church widows and the church orphans within the church. So we do need to do that, but he said, don't just limit it to that. Just don't limit it to folks in your Sunday school class or in your church. We're not to show favoritism to those who just look like us and talk like us and even smell like us. Showing favoritism is wrong. In fact, the book of James is chock full of that. Let's look at a couple of passages here out of James chapter 2. First 4 verses says, "My brothers and sisters, believers in our glorious Lord Jesus Christ, must not show favoritism. Suppose a man comes into your meeting wearing a gold ring and fine clothes, and a poor man in filthy clothes also comes in. If you show special attention to the man wearing fine clothes and say, here's a good seat for you, but say to the poor man, oh, you stand over there, you sit on the floor by my feet, have you not discriminated among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts?" Then we get on down to verse 8 and 9. If you really keep the royal law found in Scripture, and here's the phrase, love your neighbor as yourself. If you really keep that, you're doing right. But if you show favoritism, you sin and are convicted by the law as lawbreakers. So showing favoritism goes against loving your neighbor as yourself. That is a sin. So the good neighbor's reasoning can be summed up with this: what can I do to help? You know, it's not the avoidance, it's not the blinders, it's what can I do to help? Now, it's easy to see how those three mindsets apply to ministry, but what about missions? Let's kind of go back through those and think about missions as well. Too blind to see. We can be so busy with our focus, our life, our projects that we got going on, that even when we have, let's say, a missions emphasis at church, you don't even, it doesn't even register. We can be like that. We can be so wrapped up in stuff that we don't realize at work the needs, the spiritual needs of our coworkers that are around us, because we're so wrapped up in ourselves. About curious but not involved. You may know the need, can even, about missions, you can even maybe spout some facts off about unreached people groups or whatever about missions, but it hasn't prompted you enough to pray or to give or to go. Curious but uninvolved. I believe I've shared this story before. I think I'm saying that more and more as I get older. I don't know. But I had a friend, this is like 20 years ago. He was a good guy, deacon in our church when we lived up in Redfield, a friend of mine, and he admitted or confessed or whatever that he specifically did not pray for God's will in his life concerning missions, because he was afraid of what the answer might be. So he knew the need, but he just avoided praying about it because he was afraid of the proverbial sell everything you got, go live in a grass hut in Africa thing. And so he was afraid that was going to come about, so he didn't even go there. Curious, but not involved. And a good neighbor, our last one, when it applies to missions. You know, a lot of our folks here are not just missions minded, they are missional. You guys are missional. Looking for opportunities to share Christ's love, whether it's at church or at work or wherever, looking for those ministry opportunities, those mission opportunities. Because when you treat people like you want to be treated, and you realize that someone is going to a Christless eternity in hell, you think, if that were me, I would want somebody to tell me about that and save me in eternity in hell. And so you treat people like you want to be treated and find ways of sharing Christ's love with them. Got a lot of folks like that. So what are some practical ways for us to become missional? Well, first we want to anticipate needs. We need to have that, what I'm going to call a spiritual radar. We know that there are needs around us. We've got to get those blinders off and just be looking for those needs, anticipate them. So I'm going to ask you, if you would, as we go through something, ask God to just give you a spiritual radar. Turn that radar on. Because people all around us have needs, have spiritual needs and physical needs. Now, a good way to anticipate that, because sometimes those needs are costly. Sometimes they cost us some dough, doesn't it? So Bruce Wilkinson is one of my favorite Christian authors. He's the Prayer of Jabez, Secrets of the Vine, all kinds of studies. He wrote a book about 4 or 5 years ago called The God Pocket. And just to give you a synopsis, what it basically means is you decide what you're going to set aside every week. And this is above church tithes and offerings and all that stuff. This is just what you're going to do personally. $1 or $2, $5, $100, whatever. And you set that aside, and you actually have the cash set aside. And when you see that need, and God impresses on you to meet that need, you are ready. You don't have to say, hold it right there, I need to go to the ATM, or I'll write you a check and it'll clear after I get paid next week, or whatever. You've got it, you have anticipated, you're looking for the need, and when the need comes, you're ready to fulfill it and to meet that need. He does a much better job of explaining that, so I'm going to let you watch Bruce talk about that for just a couple of minutes.
What if you could take something little out of your God pocket and deliver it to a person that when they took a hold of it, everything in their life took a radical shift and joy flooded their heart? Because just earlier that same day, they were in the middle of a crisis of one kind or another, praying to God and saying, God, please show me that you're there. Show me that you care. Show me that you really do love me, not just in theory, but in practice. And God hears that person's prayer, and God knows the heart in you that you want to be partnering with him to help other people. And through God's supernatural arrangement, he brings the two of you together, and at that moment, he nudges you a little and says, this is one of the moments you've been born for, and you know it, and you realize, this is when God invades time and space for me and for the other person, and you reach in your pocket and you pull out that little tool that's little but is almost too big to describe, and you take it out and you hand it to the other person, and at the moment they open it up and see what's inside and realize God sent you to them to answer their prayer, you've experienced the joy of the God pocket. I've taught this to many people now around the country, and everybody who's ever used the God pocket come back and says to me, wait, I tell you what happened when I did this at McDonald's. Just yesterday, I went to the Max office store, and on the way out, I saw a man for the first time since I've lived in his house digging in the garbage can for some food right where I lived. And I realized, oh my goodness, this is a God pocket moment. And before that whole conversation was over and before I walked away, that man's life was changed, and so was mine. Because every God pocket is a miracle, distinct and unique, because it's made from God, who brings this person and you together, and God's in the middle, who brings you together, and all of heaven sings with joy. The God pocket. He owns it. You carry it. Suddenly, everything changes.
So that's just a neat way of anticipating, so you're ready when those needs are presented to you. Another thing besides anticipating needs is when those needs are in front of you and you're face-to-face with the person, is to sympathize with people and their pain. In our story, in verse 33, the Samaritan man not just saw, but he felt pity. He had an emotional reaction. He felt pity for this guy. We need to make sure that we don't become calloused. And I'll just admit to you, it's easy to become calloused when it comes to these kind of things. I'll just give you a personal example. A church that I was at in Liberal, Kansas, my office happened to be it was facing where you could see outside. And so you could see when people would walk up to the office. And in our community in Liberal, Kansas, it was about 50% Hispanic. And we had a good relationship with the Hispanic community. And in fact, we had a Hispanic mission and great relationship. But we just didn't have any Hispanics in our church. And it wasn't that we were barring people at the door. That was just the way it was. We just didn't have any Hispanic families in our church. And so I was sitting there working one day, right in the middle of the number crunching, and this important ministry stuff. And I see a Hispanic family walking by, and I know they are coming for some assistance. They're coming for benevolence. And I didn't get mad, but I really got kind of aggravated because I am busy. And I'm the one that has to handle this stuff. And it didn't take too many seconds for it to sink in. what business am I really in? Okay, is it number crunching? Is it producing reports, or is it meeting needs? And so it's easy, even in ministry, even as a paid Christian, to get callous. So we need to be careful. I'm just saying that as an encouragement to you to make sure that we don't let our prejudices or preconceived ideas or whatever get in the way of our sympathy and empathy with other folks. So we anticipate the needs, we sympathize with people and their pain, and then we meet that need. There's no need to delay, procrastinate, and we've got to be willing to be interrupted. Like I said, sometimes God sets up those holy appointments in our lives when we're the busiest. And we've got to be willing to slow down and meet those needs. I like to call those a holy speed bump, because we're traveling down life, doing our job or whatever at 90 miles an hour, and here comes a need. Just it slows you down. And sometimes God, I think, does that to not only help that person, but to help slow us down, to remind us, why are we still here? We're here to minister to folks. And then be willing to spend in whatever it takes. We got to be willing to do that. The man the Samaritan took the beat up guy and took him to the inn, paid for it, had nothing to gain from himself. And like I had said earlier, sometimes we're going to get taken. Sometimes that's going to happen. I know that happens in church. We have folks come in, they promise to pay back or whatever, and we're not in the loaning business. We're in the ministry business. So we look at it with that approach. That we're not looking to give this to you, to get it back later. But ministry is messy, and we've got to realize that missions is a messy business, and it'll cost us. It'll cost us time and money and energy. But the possibility of getting taken, getting scammed, should not stop us from doing good. We just need to put that up front in our head and say, maybe even half the time I might be taken, but I'm still ministering to people. So anyway, let's tuck that away. Well, we had something real special planned for you this afternoon at 4 o'clock. It was called our Embrace. We're going to embrace Whitehall. And our thought was to get us kind of out of the church, ministering to some of our folks that need some things done in our church, but as well as some other community type things. And what with all the rain that we've had, most of our stuff was outside type work. We're not going to be doing that today. We're going to postpone that. But here's what I'm going to encourage you to do, not at 4 o'clock, but at 5 o'clock, which is kind of our normal Sunday evening time. Come back with your families, and I'm going to do something fun. Okay? It's not going to be this sermon again, I promise you that. But we're going to take some of the principles from this sermon, and we're going to look at a classic TV show. Kind of combine the two. So, it'll be fun for the whole family. So, you guys come back for that. We'll have a good time with that. And look at maybe some practical things we can do as individuals, as a Sunday school class, and maybe even as a church. I don't know if it's odd, if it's coincidence, if it's God telling me I'm a bad planner, but the last time we tried this was about 2 years ago. It was a Sunday evening, and it was one of those Sunday evenings in May that turned cold. It was like 40 degrees or so, and so we had to cancel. So I don't know what that says, but maybe it says we should stop doing things as a church and doing them as individuals. I don't know. So anyway, what I want you to do today is this. Ask God to give you a spiritual radar. And some of you guys are right on track there. You've got that. You're aware of those needs, but we can probably always use a little bit better sensitivity with our radar, right? And some of us are just oblivious to the needs around us, and we need that radar turned on. So let's ask God to give us that radar. And, we are at different, as I look across the room here, I know each of us are at different stages of spiritual growth. And, just like we talked about moving a step closer to God, maybe something through today's sermon, touched you, and it's like, I need to do this, or I don't need to do that. That's just put you another step closer to God. But the first step is the most important step, and that's the step of coming to faith in Christ. And so that's the most important thing, of course. So as we have our time of invitation, which is a time of response, actually, if you think about it, it's you've heard the sermon, you've worshiped through music, you've heard the sermon. Now, what do I do about it? That's where the rubber meets the road. What do I do with this information? And so it's a time of response where you commit to God, what am I going to do about this? And most of the times you can handle that from your seat. Other times there are other things that people need to share, pray about, or something that you need to talk to one of us down here. That's great too. So what we're going to do is I'm going to pray for you, and we are going to have that time of response. So pray with